Richard Clayton was used to being in control. His voice, always steady and commanding, could make even the strongest competitors cower. But as he sat at the polished mahogany table, a smirk on his lips, there was something different about this night. He had ordered the finest steak in the house, and as usual, he expected nothing less than perfection. His mind raced with thoughts of the latest deal, of his empire growing, but for a moment, something tugged at the back of his mind. It was the waitress, Amara Johnson. She had been serving his table all evening, silent, graceful, almost invisible. But it was that quiet confidence in her step that piqued his interest. She didn't speak much, just refilled glasses and nodded politely. Richard had a habit of looking down on people like her, the help, as he often called them. But tonight, something about her presence seemed to defy his usual disregard. He ignored it. The steak arrived, sizzling on the plate in front of him, the aroma filling the air. But before he could take a bite, Amara approached his table again. This time, she wasn't holding a tray of drinks or silverware. She was holding something small in her hand, her gaze steady as she slipped a folded note onto the edge of his plate. He paused, raising an eyebrow, the edge of his smirk faltering. What was this? He unfolded the note, expecting something trivial, perhaps a request for a tip or a complaint about the service. But what he read stopped him cold. The words on the note weren't just a polite suggestion or a simple request. They were sharp, calculated, and direct. If you think you understand steak, you don't understand respect. For a moment, Richard's hand froze above the plate. The bustling restaurant around him seemed to fade into a distant hum. The note was simple, yet it carried a weight that felt heavier than anything he had ever encountered. His gaze lifted from the paper to Amara, who stood there quietly, her expression unreadable. There was no arrogance in her stance, no bitterness, just an unspoken challenge. His lips parted as if to speak, to dismiss it, to ridicule her. But something made him hesitate. Something in the air between them shifted, a tension he hadn't expected. For the first time in a long time, Richard felt as if he was the one being judged, not the one doing the judging. His mind raced. Was she mocking him? Or was this something more? His eyes flicked to the note again, his thoughts swirling. Amara's calm composure only added to the weight of the moment. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to apologize. She had simply drawn a line, and for the first time, Richard found himself on the other side of it. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he placed the note down carefully, his hands trembling slightly. He glanced at Amara once more, but she had already turned away, moving gracefully back toward the kitchen. The steak in front of him suddenly felt tasteless, as though the one thing he had always relied on, his power, had been suddenly called into question. In that fleeting moment, Richard realized something. He wasn't in control here, and for the first time, he wasn't sure what to do next. The restaurant continued to hum around him, the sounds of clinking glasses and muted conversations filling the air, but Richard Clayton's world felt quieter now, quieter than it had ever been before. He took a slow breath, staring at the note, and then at his empty plate. The silence between them spoke volumes. Amara had walked away, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The noise around him seemed louder now, almost deafening. The clink of silverware, the hum of quiet conversations, it all felt like background noise compared to the weight of the note she had left behind. He sat frozen for a moment, staring at the folded paper, his fingers lightly grazing its edges. Was this some sort of test? Did she know something he didn't? He couldn't focus on the meal in front of him anymore. His appetite had evaporated. It wasn't just the note. It was the look in her eyes, the calmness, the certainty. She hadn't been intimidated by him, not even for a second. Richard was used to people falling in line when he spoke, to those around him treating him with the respect his wealth demanded. But not her. She didn't flinch. She didn't beg for a tip, didn't flatter him. She simply stood her ground. And that made him uncomfortable in a way he wasn't used to. For a moment, he considered calling her over, demanding an explanation. But he stopped. The tension in the air had shifted, and the last thing he wanted to do was show weakness in front of the others at the table. His pride held him back. The last few minutes felt like a blur as his thoughts spiraled. Amara had slipped away, blending back into the background as she always had, but Richard couldn't shake the image of her calm face, the quiet confidence that seemed to seep into every movement she made. She wasn't like the others. She wasn't invisible. The thought unsettled him. He had built his empire on control. Everything in his world was calculated, expected, and ultimately manageable. But Amara, she was different. She was a reminder that there were forces beyond his grasp, things that couldn't be measured by money or power. For the first time in years, Richard felt as if he had no control over the situation. He had met his match in the most unlikely place, a small, seemingly insignificant restaurant with a waitress who dared to challenge him. As he tried to shake off the strange feeling that lingered, he noticed the glances from his companions. Derek Caldwell, his business partner, gave him a sideways glance, his eyes narrowing. Trent Langley, always eager to make a point, leaned in, clearly aware that something had shifted in the air. Richard could see it in their eyes. They knew something was off, but they didn't understand why. He didn't want to explain. He didn't want to share that for once. He didn't have all the answers. It was a rare feeling, one that left him unsettled and out of place. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt this way. As he sat there, his mind racing, Amara's face kept flashing in his thoughts. She had looked at him, not with fear, but with something much stronger, dignity. The kind of dignity that demanded respect without asking for it. For a moment, Richard realized something. He had underestimated her. He had underestimated the power of someone who had nothing to prove. The thought stung. The billion-dollar deal he had been negotiating, the power he wielded, all seemed to fade into the background as the evening wore on. What was more important? The empire he had built, or the person he had just dismissed? He could feel the weight of it pressing on him, but he wasn't ready to face it yet. As the night dragged on, he couldn't help but glance over at Amara every few moments, watching her move quietly through the room. She was still serving, still graceful, still in control of her own space. But something had changed. The next time their eyes met, Richard would be ready to see her for who she truly was. And in that moment, he would understand that it wasn't just the note that had stopped him cold. It was the realization that power wasn't something you could just buy. Some things, like dignity, respect, and grace, had to be earned. Richard sat in his chair, his mind still spinning from the exchange that had just unfolded. He tried to return to his conversation, to pick up where he had left off, but the words felt hollow now. The air in the room had changed, thickened with an intensity he couldn't shake. He glanced around the table at his colleagues, but none of them seemed to notice the subtle shift. They were too busy with their own thoughts, their own agendas. It didn't matter to them. What had just happened between him and Amara had nothing to do with business. And yet, in that moment, Richard realized that it had everything to do with it. The deal, the empire, the money, it was all part of a world he had created, a world where power was absolute, where respect could be bought and sold. But that world felt suddenly small. The words Amara had left behind on the note, and the look in her eyes as she had handed it to him, stayed with him. If you think you understand steak, you don't understand respect. At first, he had dismissed it. It was just a waitress. What did she know about steak, about fine dining, about the world Richard inhabited? But now, as he sat there, her words gnawed at him. They were simple, but there was a depth to them that he couldn't ignore. Richard's thoughts turned inward. He had spent his entire life cultivating an image, building a reputation that demanded respect. He had earned his place at the top, or so he thought. But what had he really earned? Amara didn't need to prove anything to him. She didn't need to flatter him or apologize for her position in the world. She had stood before him, silent and unyielding, and in that silence, she had made him question everything. He knew that people respected him because of his wealth, his influence, his ability to control outcomes. But respect? Real respect? The kind that came from within? That was something different. As the night wore on, Richard found himself watching Amara more intently than he had ever watched anyone before. She moved through the restaurant with a quiet grace, her presence somehow commanding, despite her soft-spoken nature. She wasn't trying to be seen, yet she drew the eyes of everyone in the room. She was a reminder, he realized, that there was more to a person than their wealth or status. It was the kind of realization that felt like a crack forming in the foundation of his world, a small but undeniable shift that would change everything. He wasn't used to being made to feel small. He wasn't used to feeling like he had to look up to someone. But in that moment, he did. Richard took another deep breath, trying to steady himself, to regain control of his thoughts. But the truth was, He didn't want to regain control. For the first time, he was questioning the very system he had spent his life building. And he wasn't sure he liked the answer. The evening dragged on, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something had irrevocably shifted. He had always been in control, always the one pulling the strings, making the decisions. But now, for the first time, he was wondering what it would be like to give that up, even just for a moment. Amara had made him see the world in a new light. And in doing so, she had made him realize that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the empire he had built. As the night came to a close, Richard stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He excused himself from the table, his mind still reeling from the evening's events. He needed space. He needed time to think. But as he passed by the kitchen, he caught a glimpse of Amara, still working, still moving with that quiet dignity. And for the first time, he saw her not as a waitress, not as someone beneath him, but as someone who had something far more valuable than money. Richard paused for a moment, the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. Richard had left the restaurant and stepped out into the crisp night air, but the questions swirling in his mind refused to dissipate. The streetlights above cast long shadows, and the world seemed a little quieter now, as if the chaos of his thoughts had bled into the city itself. He walked slowly, letting his thoughts settle as he made his way down the sidewalk. He had always believed that power was something you earned, something you could control with enough ambition, enough money, enough influence. But that night, something had shifted, something he couldn't easily explain. Amara had done something no one had ever done before. She had taken his power and turned it on its head. He didn't know why, but the memory of her standing there, calm and resolute, made him feel something he hadn't felt in a long time, vulnerable. The city around him hummed with life, but Richard felt as if he were walking through a world of ghosts, everyone oblivious to the revelation that had just occurred within him. He stopped at the corner, looking up at the towering buildings that surrounded him. This was his world, the world he had built. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more he wondered if it was the right world. He wasn't sure anymore. It was too easy to get caught up in the trappings of success, to forget what truly mattered. But Amara, she had reminded him. As he turned a corner and walked past a small cafe, he saw a group of young people gathered around a table, laughing, sharing stories. They were connected in a way he hadn't felt in years. A connection not based on wealth or status, but on something far more genuine. He realized that he had spent so much time building walls around himself that he had forgotten how to truly connect with others. The revelation hit him harder than he expected. He had always prided himself on his intellect, his ability to outthink, outmaneuver, and dominate any situation. But now, all of that seemed meaningless in the face of real human connection. The connection that Amara had shown him, even without saying a word. He thought back to her quiet dignity, the way she had stood tall without flinching, without apology. She wasn't asking for anything. She had simply demanded to be seen. Richard continued walking, his steps slower now, as if he were trying to make sense of the unfamiliar thoughts racing through his mind. He wasn't sure what he would do next, but he knew that something had to change. He could feel it deep inside. This wasn't just about a business deal anymore. It was about something more profound, something he had ignored for too long. He was a man of logic, a man of reason, but now he wondered if there was a place in his life for something else. Something softer, something more human. He stopped by a small park, the silence around him now more pronounced. He had always found comfort in the sound of people working, the hustle and bustle of the city, but tonight it was different. Tonight, the silence felt like a kind of clarity. He looked up at the stars above, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. There was no answer yet, no clear path forward. But for the first time in a long time, Richard felt as if he was standing at the edge of something new. Something that had nothing to do with the empire he had built, and everything to do with the person he had forgotten to be. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking in a deep breath. The cool night air filled his lungs, and he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar, hope. It was a small thing, but it was enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, the world he had built wasn't all there was. And maybe, just maybe, there was still room for something else. Something real. The next few days felt different for Richard. The world seemed to have shifted beneath his feet, though he couldn't put his finger on exactly when it had happened. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Amara lingered, her calm composure, her quiet confidence. She hadn't just handed him a note. She had handed him a question, one he hadn't been prepared to answer. He had spent his whole life making decisions based on power, logic, and control. He had built his success on being the smartest person in the room, the one who dictated terms, who made things happen. But now, in the wake of that quiet challenge, he found himself questioning the very foundations of everything he thought he knew. He sat in his office, staring out over the city, the same city that had been the backdrop to his rise, but today it felt unfamiliar. The hustle and bustle that once energized him now seemed distant, almost irrelevant. His mind kept wandering back to the restaurant, to the moment when Amara had handed him that note, and the way she had looked at him, not with fear or awe, but with a simple, unshakable dignity. It had been a long time since Richard had truly listened to anyone. He had built his empire by speaking, by commanding, by asserting his will. But now, he realized, he had stopped hearing the world around him. He hadn't listened to the people who worked for him, not really. He hadn't listened to his own gut. And he certainly hadn't listened to the quiet voices, the ones who didn't have the luxury of being heard, like Amara's. It wasn't just the note. It wasn't just the words. It was the realization that there was more to life than the endless pursuit of power. He had spent so many years chasing success, accumulating wealth, acquiring influence. But at what cost? As he leaned back in his chair, Richard found himself wondering if he had missed something along the way. He had everything: money, status, recognition, but the emptiness that had started to creep in felt like a hole he couldn't fill. The things that had once seemed so important, so essential to his sense of worth, now seemed trivial. What had he sacrificed in the pursuit of it all? His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. His assistant entered, holding a folder. Richard had expected the usual updates, the latest business moves, the financial reports. But as he looked at her, something shifted. She was just another person in his world of power, but in that moment, he realized he had never really seen her. Not the way he should have. "Richard, we have the final numbers for the Valencer deal," she said, her voice breaking through his thoughts. He nodded, not really hearing her. His mind was elsewhere, caught between the life he had built and the life he now questioned. As she placed the folder on his desk, Richard looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the subtle way she carried herself, the way she had always been there, doing the work he never acknowledged. It was the same way he had looked at Amara, the same realization that there were people around him who mattered, who had worth, who deserved to be seen, and he had been blind to it. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice different somehow. She looked at him, a bit surprised, and nodded, leaving the room. As she walked out, Richard felt something stir within him, a feeling he hadn't had in years. Guilt, maybe, or perhaps something more. It wasn't just about his assistant or his employees. It was about his entire life, the choices he had made, and the way he had been living. For the first time, he felt the weight of it all, the years of pushing people aside, of chasing success at the cost of everything else. He wasn't sure what the future held or how he would change, but for the first time, he knew he had to. The city outside his window didn't seem so distant anymore. He felt like he was finally waking up. The road ahead would be uncertain, but Richard wasn't afraid. The path wasn't about control anymore. It was about understanding. Understanding others. Understanding himself. He wasn't sure where he would start, but he knew it had to begin with something real. Something human. And that, for the first time, felt like the beginning of everything. Richard walked through the corridors of his office building, his mind still racing with thoughts from the past few days. The city outside was bustling, just as it always was, but to him, it felt like a different world. The weight of his decisions, his lifestyle, and the expectations he had lived under for years seemed almost too much to bear now. He had always been a man of action, of decisiveness, and yet now, every move he made felt like it mattered in a way it never had before. As he stepped into his office, the familiar surroundings did little to calm him. The polished wood of his desk, the sweeping view of the skyline. These things used to bring him comfort, a sense of pride. But now they just seemed to represent the life he had built around himself, a life that now felt empty. He sat down, staring at the papers in front of him, but they were just words, numbers, things that meant nothing compared to the realization that had settled in his chest. His whole life had been about control. But control over what? Over others? Over himself? Over a world that no longer seemed to care about the things he valued? The image of Amara flashed in his mind again, the way she had handed him that note, her calm eyes unwavering, even as he sat there, lost in his own arrogance. She had been right, hadn't she? Her words weren't just a critique of his behavior. They were a mirror reflecting everything he had failed to see. The respect he had so easily demanded from others. Was it truly respect? Or had it just been the result of his power, his wealth, his ability to control outcomes? He thought about his assistant, about the other people in his life who had always been there, doing their jobs, keeping the machine running smoothly. How many times had he overlooked them, dismissed them without even thinking? He had always believed that he was the most important person in the room, that his thoughts, his decisions, were the ones that mattered. But now he wasn't so sure. The realization left him feeling vulnerable, exposed in a way he had never felt before. He had built an empire on the belief that power was the key to everything. But now, that same power felt like a cage. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a squeak. He needed to get out of here, to breathe, to think. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew he couldn't stay in this office any longer, trapped in the same routine. He grabbed his jacket and walked out of the office, his steps purposeful but uncertain. The elevator doors closed behind him, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like a man who wasn't in control of his own life. He needed a change, but where to start? As he walked down the street, the noise of the city felt oddly comforting. The world was still moving around him, people rushing to and from their destinations, absorbed in their own lives. He had always been part of that rush, part of the machine. But now, he wasn't sure he wanted to be. He passed a small cafe, the warm light spilling out from the windows, and something inside him stirred. Without thinking, he walked in. The soft hum of conversation, the clinking of coffee cups, and the smell of freshly baked pastries. It all felt so simple, so real. He ordered a coffee and took a seat by the window, watching as the world went on outside. For the first time, he didn't feel the need to control everything around him. He just sat there, letting the moment pass, letting the chaos of the world swirl around him without feeling like he had to fix it. As he sipped his coffee, he realized something. It wasn't about power. It wasn't about control. It was about connection, about finding a way to be present in the world without trying to bend it to his will. Richard had spent so many years building walls around himself, isolating himself from everything and everyone that didn't fit into his carefully constructed vision of success. But now, in this quiet moment, he saw that those walls had kept him from truly living. He wasn't sure what his future held, but for the first time, he felt a sense of peace. Maybe it was time to start tearing down those walls, to start seeing people, not as tools, not as obstacles, but as people. He finished his coffee and stood up, ready to face whatever came next. The world hadn't stopped turning, but for Richard, something had shifted. It wasn't about the empire he had built. It was about the connections he had neglected. And he knew that, for the first time in years, he was ready to make a change. Richard found himself walking the same streets once again, but everything around him seemed different now. The city's energy, once so familiar and comfortable, now felt distant, almost foreign. It was as if the world he had known for so long had changed overnight, and yet, he himself was the one who had undergone the transformation. His footsteps were slower, more deliberate as he walked, his mind still reflecting on the revelation he had come to in that quiet cafe. The decision to step away from his office, away from his routine, had felt impulsive at the time. But now, as he walked through the city streets, he realized that it was one of the most important decisions he had ever made. For years, he had lived his life like a businessman, constantly chasing success, always looking for the next deal, the next big win. He had thought that power, wealth, and control were the measures of a successful life. But now, he understood that there was something far more valuable than all of those things: human connection. It was something he had neglected for so long, buried under the weight of ambition and the expectations he had set for himself. The realization hit him like a wave. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had lost sight of what truly mattered: people. The ones who worked for him, the ones who quietly went about their lives, contributing in ways he had never noticed. People like Amara. She had shown him something he could never have learned from a boardroom. The value of simply being seen, of being respected for who you were, not what you could offer. As he continued walking, he found his thoughts drifting back to that night at the restaurant. The way Amara had handed him the note, so calm and composed. The way her eyes had locked with his without fear, without hesitation. He had expected to dismiss her, to brush off her challenge. But instead, she had made him stop, made him question everything he had believed in. Richard wasn't sure how it would all unfold, but one thing was clear. He couldn't continue down the same path anymore. He needed to change. The shift in his perspective had been profound, and it was only the beginning. The empire he had spent his life building suddenly felt less important, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the life he had created had been based on something false. He had built his success on being feared, on controlling everything around him. But in the process, he had neglected the things that truly mattered: relationships, respect, trust. These were the things that Amara had shown him, without even trying. She hadn't been trying to teach him a lesson. She hadn't been trying to change him. She had simply been herself, and in doing so, she had changed him more than any business deal ever could. Richard stopped for a moment, looking up at the sky. It was still early evening, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the city. He felt the weight of the past few days sink in. He wasn't sure what the next step would be, but he knew that he had to take it. He had to find a way to rebuild, not just his company, but his life. And that meant making room for the things that had always been there, waiting for him to notice them. He walked on, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. There was no clear plan, no definitive answer, but for the first time, he felt hopeful. He knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be setbacks, moments of doubt, but he was ready to face them, ready to see the world in a new way. And maybe, just maybe, to finally see the people around him for who they truly were. The days that followed felt like a blur, but Richard's mind was clearer than it had been in years. Every conversation, every decision, felt different now. He was more present, more aware of the people around him, the ones he had spent so many years overlooking. It wasn't just the shift in his own perspective. It was the way the world seemed to react to his change. At work, people were noticing. His assistant, who had always been polite but distant, seemed more engaged when they spoke. His employees, once nervous to speak their minds, now seemed more willing to contribute, to offer their ideas without fear of judgment. Richard noticed the little things, the moments where people were finally seen, where their voices mattered. It felt like the air in the office had shifted, too. He had always been known for his ruthlessness in business, for his ability to close deals and command respect. But now, that same presence seemed to carry a different weight. It wasn't just about intimidation anymore. It was about connection. The change wasn't easy, and there were moments when Richard found himself slipping back into old habits. The urge to control, to dominate, would rise up, but he was learning how to fight it, how to sit with discomfort rather than react to it. There was one moment in particular that stood out to him. It was a meeting with a new potential partner, a company that had been hesitant to work with him in the past. As Richard sat across from the CEO, he realized that he wasn't focused on what he could get from the meeting. He was focused on what the partnership could mean for both of them. He listened more than he spoke, genuinely trying to understand the other side. It felt strange at first, like a part of him was missing the old confidence, the one that was always ready to argue his point, to win. But as the meeting went on, he realized that listening, really listening, wasn't a weakness. It was a strength. The deal was signed that day, but it wasn't just about the numbers. It was about a shift in perspective, one that had been building for weeks, ever since that night at the restaurant. Richard knew that it wasn't just about changing his approach to business. It was about changing his approach to life. He had been so focused on the idea of success, on the idea of building something big, that he had forgotten what made life meaningful. It wasn't the money, or the buildings, or the contracts. It was the connections, the relationships, the moments of understanding that built real trust. In the weeks that followed, Richard made a point of spending more time with his employees. He listened to their concerns, their ideas, and he realized just how much he had missed over the years. There was one conversation in particular that stayed with him. It was with a young man in his team, someone Richard had barely noticed before. The man was talking about his family, his dreams outside of work, and for the first time, Richard saw him as more than just a cog in the machine. He was a person, with hopes, with struggles, with a life outside of the office. It struck Richard deeply. He realized that he had built his success by focusing on the big picture, but the true strength of a company, of any organization, came from the people within it. Richard started to shift his focus. He started looking for ways to foster a culture of respect, of understanding, where everyone had a voice, where everyone mattered. He knew it wouldn't happen overnight, but he was willing to try. The change wasn't just in the office. It was in every part of his life. He started making more time for the things that had always been important, but that he had neglected: his family, his friends, and most importantly, himself. One evening, as he sat on his balcony looking out at the city, he thought back to that night at the restaurant. He thought about Amara and the way she had quietly challenged him. He never would have expected someone like her, someone he had once dismissed, to change his life in such a profound way. But that was the power of true respect. It wasn't about status, or power, or wealth. It was about seeing people for who they truly were, not what they could do for you. And for the first time, Richard felt like he was starting to see the world clearly. He had spent so many years building a life that was focused on the wrong things. But now, he was building something different, something that wasn't about control, but about connection. Richard stood in the middle of his office, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city that stretched out before him. The skyline, once a symbol of his success, now seemed almost distant, like something he had once conquered but no longer needed to dominate. The view was beautiful, but Richard wasn't looking at it the same way anymore. He wasn't looking for validation, for power, or for the next deal to close. Instead, he was looking for something else, something he had lost along the way. He thought back to the past few months, to the decisions he had made, the changes he had allowed himself to embrace. He had spent so many years wrapped in the illusion that success was about power, control, and being at the top. But now, he realized that the true measure of success wasn't in what you had, but in how you treated the people around you, in the relationships you built, and the respect you earned by simply being human. His office, the one he had spent countless hours designing to reflect his status, now felt like a shell. The things he thought he wanted, the accolades, the recognition, had all seemed empty without the connection he had long ignored. And it was a connection that started with seeing people for who they truly were, not as tools to be used, but as individuals with their own worth. Richard thought about Amara again, how she had walked into his world so unexpectedly, and without asking for anything, had changed everything. It wasn't just the note she had handed him. It was her presence, the quiet dignity she carried, and the simple act of standing her ground. She hadn't needed to shout or demand attention. She had commanded it with the way she lived, the way she carried herself. And in doing so, she had made Richard question everything he had thought he knew about power and respect. He had reached out to some of his colleagues, the ones who had been with him for years, and instead of holding meetings to discuss quarterly profits, they spoke about their lives, their families, their experiences. Richard had made the decision to understand them, to ask more than just surface-level questions, to listen, not just to their ideas but to their stories. The results were surprising. The more he listened, the more he learned, and the more he realized just how little he had really known about the people who worked beside him every day. The change wasn't instant, and it wasn't always easy. There were moments when the old Richard wanted to resurface, the one who controlled, who judged, who sought to dominate. But Richard now understood that power wasn't in making people feel small. It was in elevating them, recognizing their worth, and building a team that thrived because of mutual respect. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be challenges, moments where his old instincts would fight to take control, but he also knew that the person he had become was stronger, more grounded, and more connected than he had ever been before. It wasn't just about closing deals anymore. It was about building a company, a life, a legacy that he could be proud of, one that was rooted in the kind of respect that could never be bought. As he walked out of his office and into the hallway, he was greeted by his team, not with the usual apprehension that he had become so used to, but with smiles and genuine warmth. They weren't just employees, they were people, and for the first time in a long time, Richard truly saw them. He knew that the future was still uncertain, that there was still work to be done, but as he stepped forward, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't sure exactly where this new path would lead, but he was ready to walk it. Because for the first time, Richard understood that the real measure of success was not in what you build alone, but in what you built together.